Hi, everyone, and welcome to the GreenThumb Grow Together conference. My name is Mara Gittleman. I'm the Workshops and Education Coordinator for NYC Parks GreenThumb. We are the part of the New York City Parks Department that works with community gardens across the city. We're really thrilled to be here today with Perl, Egendorf, and Hannah Shayler from Cornell, and we're going to get started in just a minute. So without further ado, I am going to pass the mic to Perl, who will get us started.
Great. Thank you so much, Mara. Thank you, Serena, Triwana, Elena, and everybody at GreenThumb for having us here today. It is our absolute pleasure to join you. So I'm now sharing my screen and I'll begin. So my name is Sarah Perl Egendorf. I go by my middle name a lot. I use she, her, or they, them pronouns. I'm here with Hannah Shayler, who also uses she, her pronouns. And we both represent Cornell in different roles and capacities, which we'll explain a little later in the presentation. Because sometimes there's, a lot of people at Cornell, don't always know who's who, but we'll clarify that. So today I'm going to have, start with some acknowledgements, celebrate the work that urban gardeners do to create healthy soils and healthy cities. That's really what we're here to talk about, both what gardeners can do and what they are already doing, and how important these practices are for maintaining personal, community, and environmental health. Going over some solutions for how to deal with contaminants like lead in soil, and really focusing again on these practices, and then a little bit about how you can get clean soil and compost. And at the end, we really want to hear from you. Share your questions and experiences. So with that, I want to start with an Indigenous land acknowledgement, recognizing that everyone in New York City is in Lenape-Hoking, the Lenape homeland. And I want to acknowledge Lenape community, elders, the past and present, and the future generations to come. I, as a settler, recognize that the soils I cultivate do not belong to me. And I also want to invite all of us to work towards dismantling these ongoing legacies of settler colonialism and supporting Indigenous rematriation of these lands. I also want to acknowledge and thank the work of urban growers and everything urban growers do every single day. So you know who you are. Thank you for doing this and supporting food justice, food sovereignty, personal health, community well-being, urban green space, reducing waste, mitigating climate change, and enhancing ecosystem services. So thank you always for all of this amazing work that you do. And I also want to acknowledge that Black Lives Matter in this work and in all work, and to recognize that it's really Black, Brown, Latine, Indigenous, Asian, all different communities of color who are making this possible. So thank you. So if you haven't already, please tell us in the chat why you're here, what you'd like to get out of this workshop, because we want to make sure that we address that. We have tons of info we'd love to share. We want to make sure we're answering your questions. All right. So as I've mentioned, urban gardeners do all of this amazing work. You create healthy soils and healthy cities every single day. And there's a lot of new research coming out that looks at the fact that there's new research, there's old research, looking at the fact that you all do this in contaminated environments. This is the nature of this work in a city. And really, where do these contaminants come from? We know that there's legacy paint. A lot of paint was used with lead. There's legacy gasoline. A lot of gasoline with lead in it was emitted to the environment. And when it lands in soils, it can stay there, cling to soil particles. And then these soils or dust can blow around the city, enter the atmosphere, and then be redeposited. So this is some research that Hannah and I have looked into. Many other researchers have looked into this, and this article just came out February 2022 in Durham, North Carolina, looking at these processes and how people are exposed inadvertently from the presence of these legacy contaminants. I also want to note how important it is to recognize that not everyone is exposed in the same way, and often it's communities of color and chronically disenfranchised communities who are most exposed. So this is an urgent environmental justice issue, one that urban gardeners contend with and address. So that being said, as I mentioned, government agencies have recognized contamination for a long time. Researchers have recognized this for a very long time. And some more new research just came out officially this past month, recognizing that this knowledge exists, and yet there is no systematic program in the US to address soil contamination. And so these researchers identified more than 60 different programs of researchers and extension specialists and organizations working with communities and highlighting the really important work that the growers do every day in collaboration with researchers to address this problem. So, as I mentioned, all of these people are doing this work, sharing resources for testing and really for limiting exposure to contaminated soil. So what we're offering here today is part of this broad diffuse network of researchers and organizations throughout the US. Spoiler alert, some of us were interviewed in this article. So you can see, and if you look at some of the info, we can share the PDF. You can go to links here. I mean, it's really amazing to think about how important this work is across the country and the world, and who is doing this labor. So what is this labor all about? Right? We're trying to address contamination, limit exposure. And there are some really common misconceptions, questions. It can be confusing. So we always want to go over this. What can you do if you've got lead in your soil? When I can see people in a room, I like to ask if anyone's ever heard of phytoextraction or the ability for plants to remove lead from soil. Sometimes we like to see a show of hands. A lot of people have heard of this, especially sunflowers being able to remove lead. And yeah, I see a hand, and I hate to be a bearer of bad news, but I got to tell you, it doesn't work. So we love sunflowers. Plant all the sunflowers you want, but don't think that it's going to remove your lead, not safely, not on human timescales. Maybe in a couple hundred years, but people are exposed during that time. So this is, doesn't work. But it's good news that most of your crops, even if there are contaminants, they're usually pretty safe, especially as long as you wash them. Not recommending growing in contaminated soil, but recognize that you're not going to easily remove contaminants like lead. How about adding amendments, making lead less toxic or less bioavailable? Sometimes people have heard about doing that. One thing you can use is compost. We love adding compost. You don't necessarily want to add too much for various environmental reasons. But in terms of addressing contamination issues, adding compost can be good. It can dilute the overall amount of lead, but it doesn't solve your problem. It can be tricky. Basically, there are different methods to test this bioavailability. There's a lot of phosphorus in compost, and if you've got other contaminants like arsenic, it can become more available. So adding compost is great, but again, not going to solve your issue. Okay, can you dig it up and haul it out? Certainly, especially if money is not a constraint. This can be very, very expensive, very logistically challenging, and can be very disruptive in the process. So what about covering it? As you see here, you can add a geotextile to separate contaminated soil below, bringing in new soil above, and that really works. So absolutely, that's what you can do. Bringing in new soil, building up that new soil really is one of the most effective practices that we can take. So with that, I'm going to let Hannah take it over with the rest of the really important practices that growers do.
Thank you, Pearl. And next, we're going to just tie this back more directly to what we see a lot of you doing in your gardens, and things that we see both through the science and on the ground in gardens and community gardens and people's backyards and all kinds of places that are working and are helping to build healthier soils. So this is just a screenshot of one of our outreach documents that gives just kind of the quick and dirty. Here are some 10 best practices for healthy gardening. And we're going to walk through them in a little more detail to work through, to build on what Pearl was just discussing. So next slide. So a little bit more about using clean soil and compost. One thing to consider here is that whenever possible, we want to be growing in the best material that we have access to. And as Pearl said, often our urban environments are contaminated from past site use and just general environmental contamination. So where we can, often it's best to build up on top of what's there. If we're not sure about a source that we'd be getting materials from, we can consider testing, or potentially consider testing the soils that exist if we think they might not be contaminated. For those of you in GreenThumb gardens, GreenThumb does an excellent job of helping with access to soil and compost. Just one note, due to ongoing supply chain issues with COVID, we're still having some shortages of testing availability and long turnaround times and sometimes garden materials. So just contact your lab or supplier for the latest info as we're talking about some of these practical tips. But overall, by adding organic matter to our soil, overall, we're building the health of our soil. We're we're creating soils that are going to be a better medium for growing plants. And that organic matter, as Perl said, is going to dilute and absorb contaminants. It basically can form strong complexes with toxic metals that doesn't make those metals go away, but it keeps them in the soil rather than being more likely to get taken up or move around. And improves overall properties like soil aggregation and fertility. It's just going to be an overall better medium for growing in. And a big one, it helps to keep soil dust down, which we're going to learn more about how soil dust moving through gardens can help bring people and crops in contact with contaminants. And there's still some questions that are being addressed through ongoing research about what are the best mixtures? How much compost should we be adding? How do we, with the resources that we have available to us, especially in New York City, create the best mixtures in order to grow our plants in raised beds or really in any other location? Next slide. And so again, often raised beds are the way to go. We see many of you using raised beds in the city. That said, a framed box is not the only way of making sure that our plants are not growing in or near contaminated soil. Though in many gardens, including GreenThumb gardens, it's the recommended practice. And really, we want to think about what our plants are growing in and what they're near, including avoiding building beds out of materials like treated wood that may be an additional source of contaminants. In the past, we had contaminants like chromium and arsenic that actually came in through the treated wood itself. Those products are no longer commercially available, but in general, it's best to avoid treated lumber and to instead use something that we know is free of contaminants. And here's just some pictures from a bed building project at NYCHA Ravenswood. This is Perl and some youth community partners. And yeah, so this was a couple years ago, but you can see these gorgeous beds waiting to be filled with more soil. And just a reminder, as we've worked with different gardens and gardening groups over the years, just how helpful it can be to keep good records of what you did and how you did it and where you got supplies. And especially any testing information, like if you're testing your soils for lead or any other properties, just so whomever works on that site in the future can build upon what you've done rather than having to start over and learn from existing practices. Covering or mulching soil is a big one to help keep dust down in beds and pathways. It can also just look really nice and have other benefits for preserving the health of our soil. But what we've learned through our own research and those of others is that it's really contamination by soil particles. So physical contamination by soil landing on plants that's accounting for most lead in the vegetables that we eat, not plants taking up lead through the roots. And this is a good thing. This means that it's easier for us to control that dust at the surface by using things like mulching with a variety of materials or cover crops, so that we can limit contamination and keep dust particles from getting onto our edible plants. And also from getting up into the air where people could then breathe it in, or it gets all over our clothes. It just keeps that potentially contaminated dust in the soil where it belongs. This was some research that our team published last year on the importance of mulch. And there's a lot going on here in this diagram, but really we just wanted to briefly share the type of research that we do, which is thinking about how can we support gardeners in keeping themselves safe from contamination while also growing a variety of healthy foods. And one of the things to consider is how those contamination particles might be moving in the garden environment. So are the plants taking up something like that from the soil? We're learning that no, under most circumstances, that really is not what's happening. Are the particles coming from atmospheric deposition and kind of coming from above on a bigger scale? And, that's still something to be learning about and to be paying attention to. But we're seeing really strong evidence that it's really splashed from the soil relatively close by the plant, not necessarily right at the root zone, but near the growing area or in the growing area, that gets those particles, splashing up from the surface of the soil onto the leaves. And you can think about something like lettuce or kale or herbs. With all that nice leafy surface area can be really efficient at trapping particles. So the best way to protect ourselves and to keep our food healthy is to keep those particles off plants in the first place. And the experiment that we did in Ithaca and in New York City showed how mulching was a really effective tool in keeping those particles down in the soil, not jumping up onto plants.
Shout out Heart to Heart Garden in Bed-Stuy, GreenThumb Garden.
Thank you, Perl. Yes. Next slide. Thinking about general soil properties and how they relate to contaminations, we really want to be sure that our soils have enough nutrients for our plants, just for overall soil health and plant health. And same with pH. If our pH is too low or too high, our plants aren't going to be happy. But also from a perspective of being careful of soil contaminants like lead, at lower pH levels, lead can be more available in the soil. The good news is that data show pretty clearly that most New York City soils and urban soils in general tend to have pH in the neutral or a little bit higher range. So that's really good when we're thinking about lead. But really, we don't have much lead that gets taken up into plants anyway. And especially when we have our pH up near neutral, that keeps the lead out of the plant. Plants are really good at keeping it out of their tissues. Some other chemicals, contaminants like arsenic can be a little bit different. So that's just something to be aware of and understand more about your soils and what you might be dealing with. But generally, if we're doing things to try to be as safe as possible from lead, that helps us to keep our soils healthy and to keep our bodies safe from things that might be in our soil. Some other things, thinking about where we're growing our food, where we might be working with the soil. A lot of community gardens or other gardening areas, school gardens may have play areas nearby. So not just thinking about where vegetables and fruits are growing, but also just any place where people might come in contact with soil. So for example, putting barriers under a play area, if we either know that there's contaminated soil or concern about contaminated soil, can be a really great way to just keep those contaminants like lead down below and not in contact with people. And likewise, we really want to think about where our children are playing. Ideally, we want our kids outside. We want them eating their fresh vegetables. We want them getting nice and muddy and dirty. But if we can have that happen in a place where we're more confident in the quality of the soil, that can help to protect our kids. And so just whenever possible, if there's a choice and you know more about one spot than another, encourage those kids to play in the place where the soils are a bit healthier. This lead can be especially harmful to the developing brains of young kids, which is why that's such an important thing to pay attention to. And we see a lot of you really taking advantage of just kind of basic practices like basic hygiene. Again, we want you working in the garden. We want you to get dirty. We want to be in contact with our soils, but by washing our hands after, wearing gloves when appropriate, and just trying to leave the soil outside rather than tracking it into our homes on our gardening clothing or on our boots, or, if any of you have pets, dogs can bring in a lot of soil. Washing our vegetables in a place where we can keep that soil from getting all over. That way we're just keeping it away from different ways that people could be in contact with it. We don't want it all over our floors and then our kids crawling on that and breathing it in. And a big one, which we'll get into the next slide as well, washing and peeling produce. Again, there are times where we all want to enjoy that fresh tomato straight from the plants. That's totally wonderful, but in general, if we have cause to think that there's some soil on our plants, and especially if we may be wondering what's in that soil, let's wash it off really well before we eat it. And for some vegetables, if appropriate, peeling can help too. And really, we want to grow a variety of crops. That's the most important thing. Good nutrition, growing crops that are culturally important, the things that we want to cook with and eat with and be surrounded by. All of that is a huge priority. That said, if we are, because of circumstances, growing in a situation where we may be a little bit more concerned about contaminants, fruits and vegetable fruits can be a really great way to protect against contamination. As I said before, the plants are really good at keeping contaminants out of their tissue, especially with lead. There's very little that's taken up into those roots. And fruits and vegetable fruits are also a little bit away from the soil. A lot of them, like tomatoes and peppers, something like eggplant, you can wash off really well. It doesn't have those leafy folds that can trap dust particles like some other crops. So they can be a safer choice if contaminants are a concern. But overall, we really want to work towards growing those healthier soils in the first place so we can grow all of the crops that we want to have available to us. And so just to highlight some new research that we've been working on the importance of washing crops. And this research is being prepared for publication and under review. And again, it's probably hard to see the details here, but basically we grew lettuce in soils that had pretty high levels of lead. And we compared what it looked like if we didn't wash the samples at all to washing them with different methods, including just rinsing them with water versus soaking in water versus soaking in vinegar or a commercial product like a veggie wash product. And really what we want you to see here is that first bar is much higher than all the others. Those are the unwashed samples. Whereas everything else, we nicely get the levels of lead in that lettuce down below the level at which it's potentially a concern for health. So it doesn't really matter how you wash, just wash those crops, especially leafy things like lettuce and herbs and kale and similar crops.
Great, thanks, Hannah. So again, these practices that are very simple, that so many growers do every single day, really are the best things you can do to protect yourselves and your broader communities. And as we've been talking about how important it is to just build that healthy soil, all of you GreenThumb gardeners can get soil delivered from GreenThumb. And we also want to talk about this resource that's available in our city, especially to growers that are delivering to school gardens, many other community gardens. Anyone can request this soil. GreenThumb will generally make the transfer though through GreenThumb. But we have this resource with the New York City Clean Soil Bank. And this is a unique program that provides freely available growing materials to anyone in the city, delivering in Brooklyn and Queens. I'll be clear about that, but anyone can pick up these materials. And so what it is a program that was started by the New York City Mayor's Office of Environmental Remediation. And they call it the Clean Soil Bank, but as a nerdy scientist, I have to say, what they have are deep, deep excavated materials from development sites that have been shown to be really, really clean, pristine, generally left here by the glaciers some 20,000 years ago. So they're sediments. They lack organic matter of other soils. They're subsoils, mostly sand. And here are some of our Cornell Cooperative Extension specialists of urban ag digging in this big pile of sediments. And what you can do is mix that with compost provided by any of the fantastic New York City compost project sites. Here we have some compost from Big Reuse that is light enough for kids to lift up. And you can bring them to gardens. I've been involved in a number of pilot studies with GreenThumb gardens, Brooklyn Queens Land Trust gardens, and also NYCHA gardens. And then you can mix them, put them into beds. I mean, the material is heavy, but it's a fantastic workout. You can put them into the beds. And then what we've been doing on the research side is really trying to understand what's in these soils and what microbes are active and what activities are going on. And so we know that they're clean from contaminants, but there's all these other really exciting research questions. So if you ever want to talk about those questions, feel free to follow up with us. Won't be our focus today. But here's what it looks like when these sediments or sands are being dug up from a site. It's just these huge pits of materials. And now OER actually has a clean soil bank stockpile. So you cannot tell the scale here. This is out in East New York on 4 Bell Street. These are mountains of clean dirt. It is absolutely my favorite place on earth. I mean, they're just these all different types of clean sediments with varying types of minerals in them. And it's amazing. So there's priority for local residents, but also they'll offer delivery to community and school gardens in Brooklyn and Queens. And so you can go to their website, go under contact, send an online message, and there's a request form there. So that's the easiest way to request it. And again, GreenThumb gardeners should really just go through their GreenThumb coordinator and request soil through GreenThumb, but this resource does exist, especially for broader use in the city. As I mentioned, though, these materials are really just sands. Sometimes there's silt and clay, these other size particles in there, but they're minerals for the most part. And so to make it soil or topsoil, you need to mix it with compost or some type of organic material. So that's one of the reasons why compost is so important. There's so many reasons why composting is so important for reducing waste and mitigating climate change, but also providing these nutrients. And as we've mentioned before, helping to limit exposure to the legacies of soil contaminants that we've all inherited. So there's always new issues going on with compost, and I welcome people to join, this Twitter account and do whatever you can to promote composting in our city, because it is a tremendous resource. I'll pass it back to Hannah.
Great. Yeah, before we move towards the questions and discussion portion of the session, we wanted to just share a little bit more about the soil health partnerships that form the basis of these research and outreach and extension efforts. And soil health efforts have been actively pursued by growers and gardeners and farmers in the city for decades and longer. Our group, as Cornell paying attention to this issue, has been working on this for about a decade and a half. Around 2008, we started to really formalize some partnerships looking at these issues with the overall goal of understanding how contaminants move in cities, where patterns of contamination exist, but really how can we, through research and outreach, support the work that growers and gardeners are doing to grow healthy soils, both from the perspective of protecting against contamination, but also just having the best media that we can grow our plants in. And so folks at Cornell in a number of different departments and programs have partnered with the Brooklyn College Urban Soils Lab, with Cornell Cooperative Extension, with the New York State Department of Health and other partners for years in order to address these questions. And Healthy Soils, Healthy Communities is generally focused on healthy gardening practices, like we reviewed earlier, and just this overall question of how we can support communities in making informed decisions. Our newer effort, Ag Soils of the City, is really focused on building sustainability from the soils up. And how can we source materials and evaluate those materials and combine them together and manage them over time to create the healthiest urban environments that we can. And so I just wanted to give a shout out to a couple other partners in particular, including Harvest New York. And there's also a new racial justice team organizing at Weill Cornell, who are hoping to offer partnership and support to GreenThumb gardeners and others as we move forward with learning about community health and soil health. And next slide, Perl. And just to say a little bit more about Harvest New York, I think Michaela's on with us today, and I'm not sure who else.
I saw Yolanda too.
Oh, excellent. I just wanted to really emphasize how much this partnership with Harvest New York has brought to our programming in New York City and our understanding of soil health challenges and successes. So we're fortunate to be able to work with urban ag specialists Yolanda Gonzalez and Sam Anderson, and also just this past year to have been joined by Michaela Elvey and Kwesi Joseph as urban garden specialists. And I hope that many of you in this session have interacted with some of these folks, and if you haven't, that you'll have an opportunity to do so in the future. It's a great way that Cornell has prioritized gardening and farming and urban soil health. And so with that, we really appreciate you joining us. We're putting our contact info here so that you can jot down our emails if you'd like to reach out with any questions after the session. But we have quite a bit of time left, which was intentional. And there's some links here as well, which I believe will also be in the chat and shared after the session. Pearl, anything else you want to say here before we move to some questions?
Just that I didn't mention earlier, but if you're so inclined, you can go to this EPA link and anyone can offer public comment on the importance of limiting exposure to lead. So I welcome people to go there and share their comments and views. So that's another resource and opportunity. But otherwise, we really just want to hear from you, your questions. And if you don't have questions, then we definitely want to hear your tips, how you grow healthy soils, and you can put that in the chat.
We definitely have some questions. So I'll kick us off. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. It was so informative. Let's start off by answering how can people access lead soil testing, both for Green Thumb gardens and for non-Green Thumb gardens. And if you don't have the information for Green Thumb gardens, we can say that as well after.
Well, I definitely want everyone to follow Green Thumb gardeners, follow Green Thumb protocols and policies. So if you have a specific answer for that, I welcome you to share it. If you want to say that first.
I do not. Mara, do you have an answer for that?
I'm going to put a link to the Green Thumb handbook in the chat, and that has everything in it.
Thanks.
Great. And I would say specifically for any other gardener, my favorite place to get soil testing is Brooklyn College Urban Soils Lab. And we shared a link for their website. You can go there and there's a submission form you can download and you can mail them your samples. So that's pretty local and easy. There's also other resources. Hannah, do you want to share?
Yeah, I was just going to say that our Healthy Soils, Healthy Communities website, which I think was in the chat. Yep, it's in the link is in the chat. And we do have a soil testing section on there, which has the link to Brooklyn College, as well as the Cornell Nutrient Analysis Lab, which is a Cornell facility and our neighbors in my program. It also includes a link to fines labs certified by the state, which is important under certain types of situations that may have any type of legal implications or for certain organizations following particular protocols. So that can be a useful resource to find commercial labs. Also, if there was a need for more extensive testing beyond metals, commercial labs can be a way to go. And
that's something important to say that what Brooklyn College offers specifically will be for metals like lead and arsenic and cadmium, nickel, zinc. So yeah, if you will have other.
Oh, Pearl, you're muted.
Strange. Anyway, I was saying if you had other concerns, you may want to go to other labs.
Yep, and I'm always available to help people talk through what they might want to test for. Again, Green Thumb gardeners, refer to your handbook. And I did just want to make the point as well that sometimes testing may not be the best use of resources. It may be that the best approach is to just assume that, you know what, there used to be a building here on this site. We have some concerns about the soil. Maybe there's a lot of debris in there. It looks pretty likely that what the better thing to do, and as is Green Thumb's policy, is to just build up and over. And instead of spending money on testing, maybe you just want to put your money into getting lumber and clean soil and compost and other materials to landscape your site so that you're confident that you're growing in healthy material.
Absolutely.
We always love more information and we love just learning about what might have happened at a site, but sometimes
right,
resources are limited.
Yeah, you still may need to take some action. So that's something to focus on.
Great, thank you. We have quite a few questions about different risks in the soil. So the first one is lead in the soil only dangerous if you are growing food crops? If a garden is only growing flowers, is it still dangerous to have lead in the soil?
I can start, I guess. I'll just
Sure.
jump in. And, you know, in order to calculate the risks, everyone has to make their own decisions. We can't say what to do or what not to do, but to be aware that even growing right, horticultural plants, you can still be exposed to those materials, and dusts can be inhaled, particles can land, can be on your hands and be ingested. Adults are not as at risk as children. So if children are playing in that soil, that would be more risky. But really, you need to make your own decisions for what works for you and what are the cost benefits. We would recommend still building up new soil, mulching, doing whatever you can to build healthy soil and to limit your exposure.
Just to add to that, as we said before, it's really less about what we're eating, what the amounts that are on or in the plants and getting into our bodies, and more about how we're coming in contact with those soil particles. And like Pearl said, eating the crops is just one way that can happen. So growing ornamental crops in soils where we're maybe not so sure about growing food can be a really excellent choice, but anything you can do to keep that dust down, build up new, healthier materials, wash your hands, wear gloves, those kind of things, to just be aware that there are other ways that those particles could come in contact with you. So, but there are definitely steps that you can take to do that safely and proactively. Just want to put thought and intention into it.
Great, thank you. And moving away from lead contamination, how harmful is the rat bait that they may use in gardens, or also any pesticides to control mosquitoes? Are those considered soil contaminants that gardeners need to be aware of?
That's a good question. I'm less familiar with specific products, though we have certainly had this come up before. And I think generally it's definitely a good idea to think about what might be coming in contact with your food. If it's possible to locate pesticides or other chemicals away from your food growing areas, that's ideal. That said, we know how much of a nuisance rats can be, and there's some degree at which you've got to just control the problem. So Pearl, I'm not sure if you have anything more specific. Otherwise, if particular gardens are using products that they're trying to understand more about, that is something that I'd be happy to help troubleshoot. And we have some contacts at the State Department of Health who have the expertise to, to understand more about particular chemicals. So if that's a concern, people are welcome to follow up with me afterwards. And Pearl, do you have anything to add based on your knowledge of particular products used in the city?
That's my sense too, that it's hard to make a general statement about all types of pesticides or all types of, herbicides, whatever. I mean, ideally, these things, as Hannah said, are not coming into contact with your food, but it happens. And so I think on a case-by-case basis, that can be evaluated.
Thanks. Someone asked, are there any concerns with contaminants in store-bought soil?
So every bag of soil that I've ever tested has had low to no metals. That's what I've seen in my limited experience. But you don't buy your bag of soil with test results on it. So ideally, places are getting, testing a certain number of times a year. They're monitoring what materials come in, but it's interesting and not regulated. The way you can get your NPK nutrient levels on your bag of soil, you can't get your metals just yet. I think this is something that should be made available. I think this knowledge should be everywhere, but we're not there yet. So if you have concerns, you can find those resources to make sure, so you can answer those questions.
And just to reiterate too, that places like GreenThumb that are getting their soils from a larger supplier, there generally are rigorous testing procedures for sources like that. And and if you're on your own and trying to find a supplier, can definitely ask whether they test their batches of soils. So that's a little bit of a different situation than bags of materials that you could purchase at a commercially at a big box store. So it depends where it's coming from. Feel free to ask questions, but as Pearl said, unfortunately, it's not something that's regulated. So though it's unlikely that they're going to be contaminated by metals, there's no guarantee.
So you mentioned that it might be more it might be more worth it for gardeners to invest in just getting new soil instead of testing their new soil. Someone mentioned that their garden has been on the same site for 40 years and they've been adding clean soil and compost every year. Can they assume that their soil is okay?
I think they can definitely assume that it's considerably better than it may have started as. And again, that's assuming it was problematic in the first place, which may or may not be true. But definitely, I mean, that many years of amending and working with soils is likely to have had a very beneficial impact. You know, we have a limited number of case studies that just kind of anecdotally we've worked with gardeners and seen some of those changes over time. But also we don't have a whole lot of data. So, you know, it's hard to say for sure. Keep doing what you're doing if you're really interested in having the peace of mind of knowing what things look like. If you have the resources, a soil test could still be really helpful.
Yeah, it's interesting that we feel comfortable assuming that legacy soils probably have absorbed some contaminants. I feel less confident automatically assuming that the new soils are optimal. There's a very good chance, but I'm not going to say, oh, definitely 100%. Like, we don't know what's being brought in, but if you're really careful about it, there's a really good chance. One thing I like to make people or help people think through is the compost that you might be making in your garden. If you've got some, some browns from the perimeter that might be in some really old soils and you bring those into your compost bin, there may be some soil particles attached to them. So that's something to really think through. And I'll be starting a new project with New York City Compost Project, evaluating some of these smaller scale compost production bins, because we should be ideally monitoring that and being really mindful of what's going in there. Because then if that's going back in your garden beds, you want to think through that and be intentional. Again, the good news is your crops aren't really taking it up. And if you mulch them, they're going to be way less contaminated too. So again, we want people to be really proactive and thoughtful and also not fearful, because there's all the data show that you're doing the right things by amending and bringing in new soils.
And just one thing to add to that, if you're making compost from your own site, and yet there's let's say there's a contaminant like lead in your soils, if you're just kind of moving it around in your own site, that's a little bit less of a concern than if you were inadvertently bringing in contaminants from elsewhere onto a site that was cleaner. So that's where we're really thrilled to see our compost producers and our soil suppliers thinking more and more proactively about this and doing what they can to test materials and build compost and build soils that are improving the health of our gardens, not accidentally being a source of contaminants. So just to think about what we're bringing in, especially if we're interacting closely with those soils or growing food in them.
Someone had a question about how the lead is transmitted from the soil to the plant. Is it taken up through its roots? And does that change depending on what kind of plant it is? They mentioned leafy greens versus other kinds of plants.
Do you want to start?
Just jump in. Yeah, it's very much crop specific. So the good news is that there are no confirmed plants taking up tons and tons of lead, enough to remediate the soil. So most plants, if they take up any lead from the roots at all, it's a little bit. Root veggies like carrots and radishes, also possibly potatoes, may take up a little bit in the roots, more than you might like to eat. Although I've spoken with a colleague at the EPA who says you have no idea how many carrots you would have to eat to actually be concerned. Like, the benefits of eating carrots are tremendous. So don't be fearful of that, but recognize that if you don't know what's in your soil, you might want to avoid roots, because they would be the most likely to have some lead taken up in their cores. Leafy greens, and then as Hannah went over, leafy greens are likely not taking up lead into the tissues, but they can trap dust particles. So as long as you wash them, you're in pretty good shape. Leafy greens could be a little more tricky than fruiting crops like tomatoes, eggplants, cucumbers. Those are the safest to grow in unknown or variable or potentially contaminated soils, because they not only they won't be taking up lead into their tissues, and they're very easy to wash off any particles.
And just as a comparison to that, so picture you have a carrot from your garden and maybe it has a whole lot of soil on it. And maybe all you do is kind of give it a quick rinse and then eat that carrot without peeling it. There still isn't that much soil on it that you would be bringing into your body. And as we've learned, there's very little lead that actually gets into the plant itself. Whereas if, let's say that there was a child playing in the mud in a garden and actively eating the soil itself or breathing in the soil itself, that's really where we're concerned, because there's a much higher proportion of lead that could get into our bodies directly from the soil rather than through the plant and then into our bodies, if that makes sense. So the more careful we can be with the soil itself, if we know that it's high in something like lead, the more we can protect ourselves and our families.
Thank you. That was so helpful. I didn't know that. What about, are there any insects or fungi that you can introduce to your garden that might be able to process and remove contaminants?
Again, there's a lot of research out there on this topic, and you can follow up with folks if you're interested in looking more into it. All of these organisms, bacteria and fungi, can be tremendously beneficial for your soils. And some of them really can bind with lead particles and make it less harmful to the human system. Again, it's not a guarantee that you have no issue. If lead is there, even when it's trapped by these microorganisms, there could still be some potential harmful effects. So we love these beneficial microorganisms, but they may not just solve your entire problem, is my answer to that.
And maybe we should point out that there's a little bit of a difference here when we're talking about chemical elements like lead versus something like organic contaminants or like a pesticide, which are, so like organic contaminants like a pesticide are complex combinations of different types of chemicals and molecules. Whereas when we're talking about lead, it's a chemical element. It's one of the elements in the periodic table, which means it's one of the basic building blocks of stuff on Earth. So it can't break down into anything else. It's going to stay as lead. It's just a question of where is it? How much is it going to move around our gardens or around our soils? And how available is it to our plants or to our bodies if it ends up in our bodies? Mm-hmm. So in some cases, there is a process whereby, or contaminants from oil spills, there are chemicals that can break down and are especially boosted by activity of microorganisms and other living things. But when we're talking about chemical elements, it's a bit different because they can't break down into anything else.
Absolutely.
I know you mentioned one way to avoid being exposed to lead personally would be to wear gloves. Would something like an N95 mask help in terms of being exposed to lead in the garden?
Anytime you're working with contaminated soil, especially if you know that's what you're working with, absolutely. And so that's a pretty good protocol to put in place. And in all of my experience working with contaminated soil, we definitely were wearing masks.
Yeah. And it is an interesting kind of side benefit of COVID precautions, which, especially last year, the hand washing and the mask wearing are practices that are protective for a variety of reasons. So again, that isn't always.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, again, use your judgment about what's best for your situation. But if you're concerned, then yes, definitely anything that puts a barrier between your body and the soil particles can be helpful.
There was an interesting article that came out too, comparing the measures you take to prevent exposure to lead with the measures people are taking to prevent exposure to COVID. And there's some synergy there.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. You mentioned a little bit of this at the beginning of your presentation, but just to reiterate for all the participants, do lead and arsenic dissipate naturally over time?
I'd actually like to share, because again, I'm a nerd who loves research, some research that's been done in New Orleans and now also a little bit in Detroit, where Howard Milkey's the researcher in New Orleans who who we call our godfather of lead in soils. It's because of his research in the late 70s and early 80s that we started to pay attention to these particular risks, especially for children in the urban environment. And what he found, mapping the entire city of New Orleans, is that over a span of about 15 years, from the early 2000s to the, around 2015 to 2017, the lead levels overall in the entire city in the soil did decrease slightly. And they're seeing a similar trend in Detroit. And this may be occurring. Exactly what's causing these decreases is what we need to figure out. Could be moving down the soil profile, new materials added on top could be, covering it essentially. So this is great news, but it doesn't mean that people aren't still potentially exposed, especially chronically disenfranchised communities, and communities of color. So there still are really important issues to pay attention to, but there are changes, especially over these longer timescales. And one thing I like to add too is that, the earth always is adding new layers of materials on top of the old. Rivers deposit sediments, volcanoes erupt. There's always, plants are adding more material to soils. So us building more soils on top of the old layers is really in alignment with what the earth does naturally. So to me, it's not just covering up the problem and forgetting about it. We need to know about the problem and still take, really sound, common sense, aligned practices, into our own hands.
And it's also a responsible and sustainable way to deal with the problem of contaminants, in that generally it's too expensive and too just logistically challenging to excavate soil and haul it off somewhere else. Very rarely do sites have the money or the capacity to do that. But then the other problem with that is that, of course, that contaminated material is going to go to a landfill or go somewhere else and has the potential to be a problem in the future. So the more we can build up and know that we are taking steps to not just move this stuff away from ourselves, but cover it up so that it can just exist there below the layer in which humans are interacting with the soil, it can just be a really effective solution.
I just realized I didn't answer for arsenic, which, as Hannah showed in one of the plots, behaves very differently from lead in soil. And so while lead frequently, especially in neutral or high pH, clings really tightly to soil particles, so any movement could be really slow, sort of as a particle, moving down a soil profile. Arsenic can actually move more freely with the water flowing through soil. So arsenic can enter groundwater and be really problematic. I mean, us in New York City, we don't drink our groundwater, so that's less of an issue, but in other places where people do drink groundwater, if there is a source of arsenic, it could potentially be mobilized. And be a risk in that way. So something else to consider.
Thank you. That was a very comprehensive answer. I appreciate that. Just to reiterate, because I think this is a very important point for people to take home, can you just talk again briefly about whether plants are a good solution to soil contamination and why or why not?
Do you want to take that, Perl? Or?
I feel like I'm jumping in a lot. You can go first.
Sure. So the short version, I'd say, is that plants are not an effective solution to take the lead up and out of the soil and remove it from the site, but can be really helpful in helping to build that soil health, to keep the soils in place, to reduce the dust that might otherwise get blown around and come in contact with people or with edible plants. So really helpful tool, but not in the way that some people hope that it would be to get to pull contaminants up and out of the soil. At least not if we're talking about lead. For some other contaminants, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So I guess if people have questions about things other than lead, that would probably be best to follow up after this session. But generally for lead, not going to take it out, can help to keep it in place and away from people and the crops we want to eat.
And if you're interested in some really nerdy details about why this is, I have an article published that's open access. You can read all the details of why, plants can keep lead in place and not remove it from soil. So if you Google Egendorf phytoremediation or phytoextraction, it's there too.
Thank you. That was really helpful. We're coming up on time, but I just want to ask one more question for people who are not in New York City. Are there any New York State resources that you recommend for urban gardeners outside of the 5 boroughs?
I think that our advice about soil testing labs still holds. The Brooklyn College lab will accept samples from all across the state, as will the Cornell lab, which is based in Ithaca in the Finger Lakes region. So again, all of the resources on our Healthy Soils, Healthy Communities site are geared towards folks in New York State and beyond. In terms of region or city specific sources of soil and compost, that's a little trickier because it changes frequently. If people are looking for specific contacts in their city, feel free to reach out. You know, we'd love to see more growing databases of gardeners sharing resources for materials and supplies. But currently that can be a little bit touch and go based on the organizations in a particular city. But
I'd love
again,
I was going to say, I'd love to add that the Walls et al. Article that we spoke about at the beginning, they actually compiled a list of researchers, extension offices or specialists and community organizations throughout the US that provide exactly these types of soil-led support systems. So I highly encourage people to look there. It's in their supplementary info. If you email me, I can also share it because I think it's an amazing resource for this country.
that's great. And just in general, cooperative extension offices can be an awesome starting point for resources for supplies and testing, both in New York State and elsewhere.
Awesome. Thank you so much, you two, for answering so many questions. If we didn't get to your question today, I pasted the Slack link into the chat. You can head over there. We'll create a channel for this workshop. We also will post the GreenThumb info email account where if you have an outstanding question, you can send us a question there. And I'm going to pass it back to Mara to wrap us up. Thanks so much.